Dr. Molefi Asante is a professor here at the Department of African American Studies at Temple University. And I might jump to go to say that he was also the person, if I can find it, who established the first PhD program in African American Studies here at Temple University in 1987. That's far back. He also has been considered by his peers to be one of the most distinguished contemporary scholars. Dr. Asante has published 74 books, and among them, I'm going to do this. Okay, here we go. As I Run Towards Africa, The African American People, Malana Karinga, an intellectual portrait of an Afrocentric manifesto, the Encyclopedia of African Religion, co-edited with Aman Mazama, The History of Africa, The Quest for the Eternal Harmony. This guy has been writing and writing and writing about our people and showing us the true connect of our African heritage along with being African Americans. I'm going to get out the way. I could continue on. He is distinguished. He is known internationally. He has done many television and radio programs, not just here in the United States, but internationally. He is recognized as one of the foremost scholars in African history and studies. Please welcome Dr. Molefi Kente Asante.
Habari gani? Hotel. Okay, it's wonderful to be here. I just want to start by, first of all, thanking the Temple University Libraries and the Charles Blockson Center, and certainly Moonstone Art Center with Larry Robbins. And I want to also just mention that Jeffrey Hart and I were on the radio many years ago. I used to host a program here in Philadelphia on WHAT and WURD for about 5 or 6 years. So I'm just delighted to know that he's aware of that. I want to thank certainly Dr. David Washington and Dr. Diane Turner, because they are hosting this event through the Temple University Libraries. And the Blockson Center is one of my favorite places. And I think that of all the universities in this country, Temple is most blessed to have the collection of this outstanding individual, Charles Blockson. I mean, if you've never met Mr. Blockson, you have missed an opportunity to meet a unique individual. I mean, in many ways, a profoundly intense man who is devoted to collecting as much as he can of the African story. So I just wanted to say that. Recently, my memoir, first copy of a memoir, was published by Paradigm. It's called As I Run Toward Africa. And in that book, I find myself celebrating the likes of Martin Delany, and I find that this individual, Martin Delany, whose life spanned nearly 2/3 of his generation, rather of his century, was a significant influence and a major influence on the thinking of many people who came after him. Delany lived during an extraordinary time. Among his contemporaries were James McCune Smith, physician and professor, Dr. and Reverend James W.C. Pennington, philosopher and minister Alexander Crummell, abolitionist and orator Frederick Douglass, and the historian and novelist William Wells Brown. Delany was not the least among these giants, and in some instances might have been considered the best or the equal of any of them, including the eloquent Douglass. Abraham Lincoln introduced Martin Robinson Delany to Secretary of War Stanton as this most extraordinary and intelligent black man. One can easily ask, what made him extraordinary and intelligent? There are several laws of intelligence. One is to have a clear sense of one's situation, psychological, social, economic, cultural, and spiritual. The second law of intelligence is to have a healthy sense of self. This was the case with Martin Delany during a time when many blacks refused to accept their origins from the continent of Africa. He was a black man who had escaped somehow the lack of self-confidence and the stain of inferiority that was spread by the white society on all people of African descent. Physically, he was jet black in complexion and was known to say, according to the famous historian Benjamin Quarles, that he was different from Frederick Douglass, because Douglass thanked God for making him a man. But Delany thanked God for making him a black man. There was something he felt in the nature of the black man's spirit, resilience, adaptability, and will to survive that made him proud of his race. Identity was important to Delany, as it is to most people. He knew something of his origin, but like most Africans who had been forced into slavery and who had lost the language, he could not go beyond a few generations. Names had been stolen and thrown away into the thin air of anonymity by the slave trade itself. Delany's grandfather had been enslaved, but Martin had managed himself to travel, to study, to demonstrate his intelligence and determination as a human being who saw himself as the equal to any man. He explored every conceivable adventure and pursuit his purse and ambition would allow. He edited a newspaper. He studied medicine at Harvard. He explored the Niger River in West Africa, negotiated with Yoruba kings. He was a major in the Union Army, lived in South Carolina as a politician, and ran for lieutenant governor, amassing an impressive vote. Delany's experiences taught him early that there were many Africans who had independence of spirit, who thought for themselves, and who desired to elevate their status. They were free even if they were oppressed. They were liberated even when they felt discriminated against in the free slums and tenements of the North. Their minds were free. Delany wrote, in The Condition of the Colored People, fleecy locks and black complexion cannot forfeit nature's claims. Skins may differ, but affection dwells in black and white the same. Were I so tall as to reach the heavens and to grasp the ocean with a span, still I must be measured by my soul. The mind is the standard of the man. Delany believed and said that white people did not know black people. Even the whites who were friends of blacks had no idea who blacks really were or what blacks were capable of, and therefore they tried to speak for blacks, dictate to blacks, and represent blacks to the world. By Delany's time, Africans had been in North America nearly 250 years. We're about 150 years or so this side of Delany. And during all those years, the basis for white ignorance was the belief in white supremacy and white superiority. So Delany said that whites know nothing of the African past. Now, of course, this is not exactly right because there were some whites who did know. Some of them did understand, but they did not necessarily share this knowledge with Africans. You know, after all, in 1822, Champollion had deciphered the ancient script of ancient Kemet. And so they knew about Egypt and that wondrous civilization, but this was not necessarily shared with African people. Count Volney earlier had written in The Ruins of Empire that the Europeans owed their civilization and their arts, even the ability to use language, to these black people of the Nile Valley. But black people in America didn't know that, for the most part. They had not been told that because of the condition, not only of the enslavement, but also among the free blacks, the ignorance, of course, that existed because we were often sometimes on the fringes of those societies. Delany honored his ancestors by speaking of the 1830 conference here in Philadelphia, when the most intelligent blacks among the free community met to devise ways of bettering the condition of African people. He wrote about it. He said, he understood that they were, he called them brave souls who had gathered in Philadelphia. So these brave souls who had gathered here in Philadelphia in 1830 to start those conventions, those almost annual conventions of African people, were as important as the whites who had gathered in this city 40 years earlier to write the Constitution. Delany knew that it was essential that African people have a historical consciousness, but his was this love, this incredible love of the African continent itself, so much so that when he went to Africa, his spirit, of course, understood Oludumare and Obatala and Shango and Eshu, and Ogun and Yamanya and Oshun. These, of course, all had great meaning to him in the Niger Valley. But Delany is not operating in a vacuum. Let's face it, without Toussaint Louverture, without Dessalines, without Christophe in Haiti, without Denmark Vesey, without Nat Turner, without Gabriel Prosser, without Mariah Stewart and David Walker, there could not have been a Delany. And Delany himself is the progenitor of Anna Julia Cooper, Marcus Garvey, Paul Robeson, Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad, and even Maulana Karenga, who's still with us. Each found in Delany's example the role of the transformatist, active, bold, independent, and fearless. Delany has been called a black nationalist. Of course, he never called himself by that label. This was the projection of white intellectuals seeking to categorize the thinking of a free, proud, and determined African man. And when you say black nationalist, again, this would have angered Delany, because basically what it was to show black people in reference to white people. Because white people are not called white nationalists. But he was a black nationalist because he believed in this independent thinking, and he was active and he was bold. So we have to label what kind of black man is this? He's a black nationalist. Those who make definitions say that black nationalism advocates a commitment to ethnic and cultural identity, to self-definition, to African unity, to self-determination, and to an intense ethical sense of justice, and to a fervent desire for independence. They say that's black nationalist. If a black person believes in that, you're black nationalist. I will never forget a debate that I had with Cornel West a few years ago up at Stroudsburg, a university up there at East Stroudsburg, in which I think he was groping for some way to make a point, and he says, "Well, Molefi is a black nationalist." And I said, "And you call yourself a Christian Marxist," which there is no understanding of that concept. Contradiction in terms. But the thing is that this title, this label, black nationalist, is a fake term. It's a false term. Delany is considered, so people say, you will see books. Delany is the first black nationalist. This is a very bad label, not because of the term black or nationalist, but the combination of the term minimizes the intellectual genius that emerged in the thinking of Delany during the middle of the 19th century. To say black nationalist is to dismiss the intellectual content of Delany's philosophy. In effect, it is much better and in fact clearer to see him as he saw himself in his own writings, in his essays, and in his novel, Blake, as a transformatist. Now, transformatist is one who contends that identity change and the acceptance of self-determination as a motivator for human maturity can bring about profound realization that one is as human as the next person. Thus, Delany was a founder of a tremendous school of thought. That's why he's the first. I call it transformative identity. He was a campaigner for transforming identity. As such, he was a transformatist. To call him simply a black nationalist is to marginalize him intellectually, as some tried to do at the beginning of the 20th century. We still see this type of writing and definition of the man. This transformatist approach would be appropriated by a number of other philosophers. The main characteristics of this approach that Delany articulated were these. One, you have to have a sense of one's people's historical relationship to the current situation. It's a very, very basic assumption. I mean, and he writes, for example, from the earliest period of the history of nations, the African race had been known as an industrious people, cultivators of the soil. The grain fields of Ethiopia and Egypt were the themes of the poet, and their garners the subject of the historian. He says, like the present America, all the world went to Africa to get a supply of commodities. This is what he's right in the middle of the 19th century in his book, The Condition, Elevation, Immigration, and Destiny of the Colored People in 1852. His second assumption was this, that African people possessed a positive capacity. He believed that Europe had undermined Africa. He wrote, these facts were familiar to the Europeans. They knew these facts because they were continually trading on the coast of Africa, as it was then the most important part of adventure and research known to the world. And if you go back and you look, of course, at the records prior to the slave trade, this is what you see. I mean, before the Portuguese decide in 1482 to destroy the capital town of Nana Kwame, what they did was trade every year. They would come, bring their ships, put some stuff, some trinkets on the shore. Africans would come, look at the trinkets, go back, get some gold, put some gold. White people come, get the gold. Africans get the trinkets. And they had a little relationship going there until 1482, when the Portuguese decided they got a lot of gold there. You know, they keep bringing that gold every year, so we may need to be here permanently to figure out how to get gold. And this is why we say that the slave trade itself was an accident of history, because the first trade that the Europeans had with Africans was gold. This was the main reason, of course, why you had this tremendous relationship. And so Delany knows. He understands this. He says, yeah, they try to undermine the capacity of African people, but we know and they know that they've been trading with Africans as equals for hundreds of years. And yet now look at the condition of black people. In his book, Blake, or The Huts of America, this was his novel. I mean, a very powerful novel. Some people think it was a response to Uncle Tom's Cabin, but in many ways, Blake, an individual who, of course, escapes slavery and participates in, is willing to participate in violence for his freedom and to remain free, is a unique character in the 19th century of America. I mean, in the sense that very few black people would have even considered this as something that you write about and you put it in the documents. People did it, of course. We had the examples of the revolts that had been led earlier in South Carolina and also, of course, in Virginia. But in terms of writing this in a novel and putting it down, I mean, it was amazing case of strong courage and bravery on the part of Martin Delany. Now, Floyd Miller in 1970 published this book, Blake, or The Huts of America, this novel, for the first time as a whole volume. It had been published in sections in 1859 and in 1861 by the author himself, because in this powerful book, and I think in 1970 it comes out at a critical time because after all, you know, in the late 60s, and I'm a child of the 60s, I always tell people the 60s were to me the most important decade in America's history. Now, of course, people can debate that because I talk to my son and he thinks it's the 90s, you know what I mean? So people have their own time trying to think of this. But the important thing is, in 1970, Floyd Miller comes out with this thought, wow, here's a book that was written years before by a black man that talks about a black man who escapes from bondage and demonstrates his will to use violence to overcome his oppressors. But beyond that, look at this. Look how brilliant Delany is. He anticipates Fanon. He anticipates Fanon in 1859. This is what Fanon is going to say later on. The third characteristic, belief in self-determination. This is why Delany became involved in the colored meetings after they had started, of course, in the 1830s. There were, important meetings. They not only met in Philadelphia, met in many places, but Paul Quinn, I've heard of Paul Quinn College. Paul Quinn was here. And Boston Cromwell, who was the father of Alexander Cromwell. They were meeting in the 1830s and so on. And so Delany decided that he would meet also. Of course, as there will be, factions and debates and arguments between the people, whether or not we should immigrate or not immigrate. And if we immigrated, where should we go? Should we go to Africa, or should we go to Mexico, or should we go to Cuba, or where should we go? I mean, these were big issues that were going on. But his belief was that African people should be self-determining to the extent that we should choose our own place. And he, of course, was critical of what had earlier with the American Colonization Society, because in 1817, you remember, the American Colonization Society said, we're going to send Africans back to Africa. And this notion in the American Colonization Society was to send Africans, particularly the ones who were troublemakers, to send them back to the continent and to keep the servile class here. And sometimes when I'm not in a totally black setting here, so I shouldn't even say this, because I start to say that sometimes when I look around, I wonder whether or not the servile class was still, but I can't say that. But I would say that if I was on Germantown Avenue at the Molefi K, Asante Institute. But when you start thinking about his understanding of what the situation was, please erase that. Whoever is videotaping this, you gotta edit that out. That is not good. That's bad. That's Molefi Asante being Molefi Asante. And that's sometimes not good. Okay, self-determination. Self-determination. I'm just thinking, when I speak, I have all these things in mind. I'm thinking of Allen West, I heard the other day. You know what I'm saying? Okay. And that's what came to my mind. I'm saying, where is this guy from? Where do we find Allen West? How do we get a Ward Connerly? I mean, where do you find a Clarence Thomas? I mean, I don't understand that. Delany would not have understood it either, you see? because there is something to this idea of being human. And Charles Fuller, one of the most brilliant writers I know, always says that African people have to understand that we can do, and we have done, everything that's human. And it's humanity, you see? And human beings want freedom. They seek for freedom. They don't seek to be servile. And so Delany himself, with his transformatist approach, was basically demonstrating and showing his humanity. And he was showing us the pathway to humanity and to freedom and to liberation. And then a fourth characteristic, a belief in separation from whites if racism cannot be eliminated. And this one, a lot of people just say, that's it, you see? They want to be separatists, you see? Well, no, his idea was, you remember, Abraham Lincoln, the president, said, this is the most intelligent and extraordinary black man. That's what the president called him. So he's not a separatist. He's not trying to separate from America. His idea was that if in America we could not find freedom and peace and a life free of hostility, then it is best for us to be in a place where we can be at peace. What's wrong with that? That's intelligence. That's not bad thinking. That's good thinking. And so in 1855, black people sent an emissary to Haiti, and they got permission for Africans in America to settle in Haiti. Many people went from Philadelphia. And when you go down to Haiti, you meet these people. Many say, my great-great-grandparents came from Philadelphia, and so on. You meet them. President Faustin Solukwe in Haiti received 2,000 Africans from the United States. And then Delany decided to take an expedition to the Niger Valley in Nigeria, which is today Nigeria, to meet with kings. And his trip, his expedition, even though he met with a few kings, his trip was interrupted by the Civil War, and he came back. And he came back and he took a commission from President Lincoln as a field officer in the Union Army. And then, so he wasn't, there was no notion of complete separation here. His idea was, how can I make this society better? And perhaps the Civil War is the best way to make it free and make the society better for everybody. The fifth characteristic, acceptance of Africa as his spiritual home. He was born in West Virginia in 1812, but he grew up in Chambersburg and moved to Pittsburgh. But he was always African in his orientation. That's why I said in my memoir, As I Run Toward Africa. I don't think that African people can really be sane until we understand our own origin, until we have some appreciation of ourselves as African people. We didn't drop out of the sky in the United States. We didn't get off the boat from Africa as Mr. Smith. That was not the we got off the boat as Gadio, as we got off the boat as Tobala Yefa. We got off the boat in a different way. You know what I'm saying? So part of this reality is understanding that Delany saw this very clearly, and but Africa was not just symbolic home to him. He saw it also in a concrete way, that African people in America that he saw were living in a situation where they basically were still in a cloud, had no understanding and appreciation of who they really were. Before Alexander Cromwell championed the intellectual capacity of blacks and created the Negro Academy, there was Delany. Before Du Bois went off to Fisk, Berlin, and Harvard to combat racist history, there was Delany. Even before Woodson conceived Negro History Week, the Journal of Negro History, and the associated publishers, we had Delany. Delany was the leader of a formidable legacy team that included a generation of men and women who defied the odds measured out by racism and discrimination. I like to think that Delany had his children, his own intellectual children, who advanced his ideas far beyond anything he imagined. Although it is clear that some may have thought that the ideas came freely to them from the heavens, not knowing that the sky had been shaken years earlier by Delany. Marcus Garvey. Central idea to Garveyism was that African people in every part of the world were one people, and they would never advance if they did not put aside their cultural and ethnic differences and contrasts. This was an idea in Delany. He understood that. He had argued this position. Malcolm X. Malcolm X believed that African Americans had to develop their own society and ethical values, including the self-help, community-based enterprises, and the search to achieve internal cooperation and unity. He prophetically believed there would be bloodshed if the racism problem in America remained ignored. He was a child of Delany. Frantz Fanon produced his greatest works, A Dying Colonialism, and perhaps the most important work on decolonization yet written, The Wretched of the Earth. On the basis of black self-determination, he wrote these works. In it, Fanon lucidly analyzes the role of class, race, national culture, and violence in the struggle for national liberation. In this seminal work, he expounded his views on the liberating role of violence for the colonized, as well as the general necessity of violence in the anti-colonial struggle. He was a leading anti-colonial thinker of the 20th century because he believed that until the colonized was able to draw blood from the colonizer, the colonized would never understand that he was human, just like the colonizer. This is the essence of Fanon. But it was also the idea in Blake, in Delany's Blake, this notion that the oppressed had to rise up and must strike the master. And then, of course, you understand your own humanity. Otherwise, you grovel in the dirt all the time as if you were not a person who could think for yourself. In the 1850s, there was a tremendous debate in this country that came to a head in the fugitive slave law. You probably heard of this. There was a big question over whether or not Texas should be annexed to the United States as a slave state. And there had been an argument about Kansas and California, and whether or not California should come in, and whether it should be slavery in California. Big debate. And this debate created not only general tension among the whites in the American society, but the black people were very frightened. Black people who had been fighting for abolition of slavery felt quite vulnerable. You remember that Harriet Tubman had made many trips, 19 trips, from Pennsylvania, this region, down to the Eastern Shore area, and had come back to the North many times. But by 1850, there was something very strange in the air. And what that was that black people would not be safe anywhere in the United States. That it was possible that if you lived in Pennsylvania and you had been an enslaved person in Maryland, your enslaver could come to Philadelphia and can get you and take you back into slavery. That would have been law. That was what was going through the minds of black people. So black people were quite anxious, much like some of our Latino and Hispanic brothers in the Southwest these days, who say, well, you know, they can pick us up anytime. We don't know. This was the same attitude. In fact, the law in Arizona is based on this fugitive slave law. Let me explain this, because y'all have to understand this. This is extremely deep. There had been a fugitive slave law passed in the United States in the 1700s, and around 1793, but it had been ignored. Nobody had enforced it. They said, you know what? we're not going to enforce this. I mean, in fact, there were some white ministers in New York State who said this law is stupid, and if a black person comes up from the South and they are looking for freedom and they want to get out of there, we will keep them in the basement of our churches. We will ignore this law that was called a fugitive slave law. So it was a big problem because in one sense, in the 1840s, there was this great movement of black people escaping this way and that way and so on. And white people in the South were going crazy. They were saying, like, you know, we got to stop this. And the white people in the North are not helping us stop it. So that was one issue. There was another issue. In the state of Michigan, black people had come up from Kentucky and had started working with the Quakers in Michigan. And so 2 counties in Kentucky decided that they would go up to Michigan with guns and fight against the blacks. And that happened. There was a war, a small war. People don't remember that. But historically, you can look it up. Small war in Cass County, Michigan, against these 2 counties in Kentucky, where these whites were coming up trying to get their Africans back. And of course, they lost. And they complained to their state legislators and their senators that we're losing our African property. And they're going to these northern states, and we get no support from these northern whites. So they drafted a law. And this law says something like this, that if an enslaved African leaves the South, goes to the North, the northern law enforcement people must, under the threat of a fine of $1,000, must assist the white slave owner in capturing, if he knows who this person is, capturing that person, holding him, and then sending them back. You had to do it. It was, if look at this, if you did not assist the white slave owner in capturing the African and taking the African back to the South, you would be fined yourself. That's the Arizona law. Law enforcement officers are bound by the law. If you stop somebody and you see that their papers are not right, you're bound by the law to arrest them. If you don't, you'll be fined $1,000. Fugitive slave law. Now, so what did the black people do? Black people say, ain't staying here. I'm going to Canada. Because they in Canada, that's right, you're free. Even Harriet Tubman went to Canada. Y'all know that. She said, I'm out of here. You know, it was good while it lasted, but I'm going to St. Catharines. I'm going to Ontario. I'm getting out of this place. It was dangerous. Many African people went away from here. In fact, John Brown went up to Ontario actually to have a conversation with a number of the blacks who had escaped, many of the prominent blacks who had escaped from the northern states into Canada, because that's where they were. But let me tell you what happened. They had escaped there, but the law was drafted in such a way that it forced the northern legislators and senators to go along with this law, because they decided that, look, they wanted to have California and they wanted to have other states as free states. So they said, okay, if you give us California and you don't enforce slavery in California, then we will let you have the fugitive slave law. You let the Southerners have the fugitive slave law. It was a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. It was a terrible decision. But quite frankly, what happened, I think, during this time shows the character, the transformative character of our friend Martin Delany, because in 1850, when Millard Fillmore, who was the president, had signed this act into law, the mayor of Pittsburgh asked Delany, who was actually he resided there and he practiced some medicine. He did many other jobs and tasks. But the mayor of Pittsburgh asked Delany, would you come and speak on behalf of the black people about this law, this fugitive slave law? And I think, in part of my training in the past, when I got my PhD at University of California, it was not in history or in African studies. It was in communication. And I studied, speaking. And rhetoric and, eloquence. I think one of the greatest speeches in America's history was given by Delany, and it has gone unknown by most people. And there's a reason why it was. And in fact, what they said after it was, he's a black nationalist. Let me tell you what he said, so you can see for yourself. So the mayor said, Dr. Delany, will you speak on this fugitive slave law? And Delany got up before these hundreds of people gathered in downtown Pittsburgh. And he said, Honorable Mayor, whatever ideas I have about liberty, I have received from reading the lives of your revolutionary fathers. And one of those ideas is that a man has the right to defend his castle, even to the taking of the life of another and the losing of his own life. You have that right. Sir, he said, my house is my castle, and in it dwell none but my wife and my children, as free as the angels in heaven, and with a liberty as sacred as the pillars of God. Sir, if any man shall enter that house in search of a slave, be he a constable, be he a sheriff, be he a judge of the Supreme Court. No, wait a minute. Let it be President Millard Fillmore, he who sanctioned this act into law, coming with his cabinet as his bodyguard, with the Declaration of Independence dangling in the air over his head, with his Constitution, the Constitution of his country, on his chest as his shield. If he crosses the threshold of my door in search of a slave, and I do not lay him a lifeless corpse at my feet, may the grave refuse my body a resting place, and may righteous heaven refuse my spirit a home. No, it is not possible. He cannot enter my house in search of a slave, and we both live. Martin Delany.